Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast, the series where I speak to people that can help us better understand human decision making and how we can influence it. Many of you work or have worked in global organisations, and so will be very familiar with the idea of having standardised approaches and policies across the world. Even if you don't, you'll be familiar with it on some level as a customer. Take McDonald's, for example. The menus aren't identical, but the quality controls and procedures they apply in their restaurants are globally consistent. So you know that whether you're eating in Sydney or Seoul, Bogota or Bologna, you're unlikely to be poisoned, and you'll have a reliable sense of the kind of things that are on the menu. The format, if you like, is standard. Now that works really well when it comes to the mechanics of fast food. Where it's more challenging is in the knowledge economy, where the performance of human capital is a key driver of the success of business. People don't lend themselves to being controlled as easily as hamburger production lines. In the knowledge economy, people are increasingly being hired for their emotional intelligence, critical thinking faculties, and other cognitive talents. The things we're really good at as a species, but also when we have the greatest potential to create human risk. Many organisations try to control these cognitive risks in the way that McDonald's does its food processes, which can be a mistake. You'll all know what I mean when I talk about policies or rules that descend from on high that make no sense on the ground. What's normal in Zurich isn't necessarily normal in Zanzibar. This challenge is particularly acute within the world of compliance, which is what I explore with my guest on this episode, Michael Kuckein. As you'll discover from our discussion, Michael is German and lives in Istanbul, where he works in compliance for a global firm. Applying global standards in a country with a culture that doesn't always conform to the expectations of Western norms is something Michael manages on a daily basis. It's not easy, and luckily he's got some fascinating ideas about how to manage that challenge, to get the right outcomes, both from a global perspective, but also locally. This challenge is something I call cultural compliance. The idea that you can't simply expect different cultures to always adopt centrally imposed compliance requirements. Rather, that you need to think about how to get your requirements to work well within those different cultural contexts. That's not about compromising standards, but it does involve understanding the way people operate in different environments. As regular listeners will know, I hate the word compliance. So rest assured, I wouldn't have invited a compliance person onto the show if I didn't think he or she had something incredible to say that was relevant to all of you, even if you don't work in compliance. And Michael's insights are relevant to anyone who works or has worked in a global environment. The need to mesh global and local is critical, and understanding cultural contexts is really important. The insights Michael shares are powerful and thought-provoking. I learned much from speaking to him, and I think you will too. So please enjoy my discussion with Michael Kuckein on cultural compliance, ideally with a nice Turkish tea in your hand, or whatever your local equivalent is. Michael, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks for having me, Christian.
It's my absolute pleasure. And look, you've got a really interesting background. And before we kind of explore some of the things that I know will fascinate listeners, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to end up being in Istanbul?
Yeah, so I'm German by nationality, but meanwhile, everybody's telling me my heart is beating Turkish. Yeah, my own family is telling me, my German family is telling me that I'm behaving more and more like a Turkish. So I'm originally a physicist. I studied physics because I was interested in, elementary particles, how the universe works, how all of nature actually functions and works. But after I had finished that with a diploma and some research, I realized that also I want to earn some money in this life. And that's why I made a slight change of career and did a postgraduate diploma in business administration on top of that. And after that, I started my career as an internal auditor first in fast-moving consumer goods company, specialized on the fields of IT and HR, which was already a quite compliance directed field, I would say. And after so many years of internal auditing in different companies and different sectors, including pharmaceutical sector, also having been exposed to some enterprise risk management, I decided it was again time for a change of careers, because I felt drawn more and more into the direction of ethics and compliance, and actually in that order. So ethics and values first, and then compliance, because as an auditor I had become to realize that the most of the root causes I saw for all the findings I had again were actually questions of values and misalignment and of culture. So I changed into becoming ethics and compliance officer, first for an Austrian organization, and then had the opportunity to come to Turkey by actually a big chain of coincidence. And I had always said from the very beginning of my career as an internal auditor, I had a special relationship to Turkey because I had many projects in Turkey. And of course, my wife is Turkish, which I maybe should mention. And we had 3 kids by the time. And I always wanted the kids to grow up also a time of their childhood in Turkey, so that they own both cultures, and that they not only know Turkey as a holiday destination and coming as little tourists here, but that they really own both cultures, speak both languages as their mother tongue, and so on. So it was exactly the right time. So 4 years ago, almost exactly, we started our journey here in Turkey, and I joined a pharmaceutical industry in the generic sector in Turkey as the country compliance officer, or head of, now it's called ethics, risk and compliance.
Wow. And I love that idea of kind of making sure that your kids understand the different cultures. And I think that's really significant for some of the things that we want to talk about, which is this idea that, you know, we think globally and we use kind of global structures, particularly in larger organizations. But actually, there's massive differences between the two. In Istanbul, and for those listeners that haven't sort of either seen it on a map or been there, it sits at a really interesting place in the world, which is literally at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. And so the city straddles the Bosphorus. And so literally you can cross from one continent to another and stay in the same city. And I think that's a really interesting piece, because some of the things that you want to pick up are really illustrative of the fact that there are different ways of thinking in different parts of the world.
And also historically, I mean, Istanbul is, as you say, at this crossroads between the East and the West, and actually has been for thousands of years. Istanbul is a large part of what you would also call like the cradle of modern Western civilization. Right? I mean, it was an important part of the Roman Empire. If you go a little away from Istanbul, but basically what's now called Turkey is actually mainly what was called ancient Greece, right? So if you go to the city of Izmir, this is actually where the School of Philosophy of Ephesus was, right?
Amazing.
Yes.
Amazing. And look, so you know, we've kind of alluded to the differences. What sort of differences have you found between what I'll loosely call a kind of Western approach and what you're seeing on the ground in Turkey?
Yeah, the interesting point is that actually this had been on my mind from the very beginning, from the very first week in my very first job. As the first official internal audit that I had in my life as an internal auditor, we went to Turkey and did an audit in the Turkish subsidiary of the company at the time. And literally the first sentence I heard there was, "Mr. Michael, you know, you have to understand Turkey is different." Turkey is different. And then I learned, just one sentence after, I learned the Turkish proverb, which is called "Tatlı yiyelim, tatlı konuşalım," which translates to English like, "Let's first eat sweet and then talk sweet." So they offered us a big plate of sweets and chocolates and delicious things. And then you kind of eat that and you establish a nice relationship. And after that, everything goes more smoothly, right? And I mean, we had some typical findings in that audit regarding conflicts of interest and other things. And I had always said at that time already, if ever in my life I want a real challenge, I want to become a compliance officer in a Turkish company. So it took some 10 more years for that to come real. But at that time, I was already married to a Turkish for a good number of years, had lots of my own private experience, and really understood firsthand that there are big differences in the perception of how does business work, how does relationship work between people. And that was personally a very big learning journey and challenge for me as a German, because I realized when I started here as a compliance officer first that there has to be a reason, and I really wanted to understand that very closely. What is the reason why we think and we perceive that compliance is so difficult in Turkey? And I had to take a mental step back and say, well, it's not that these guys here are doing it all wrong. They just don't get it. They get something. Maybe they just don't get what we mean, right? Because again, I'm also internationally married, so we are talking in foreign languages all of the time, either one side or the other side, or both of my wife both switching to a neutral language to English. So I'm very much used to the fact in normal communication that if you talk between two people, you have a sender and a receiver. If the receiver doesn't get what the sender is sending, it's not necessarily the part of the receiver that is wrong, right? It's also the way that the message is maybe sent. It's maybe the frame of reference, how you understand things. So I had to take this mental step back and say, well, how do people here actually perceive the world and how business functions and how things are? What's their relation to rules and principles and good and clean business, all these things? And what is my idea that I have to bring to them how it should be? And where do these clash and why? And then maybe I understand where the conflict is. And maybe out of understanding that conflict from their perspective and my perspective, I can find a way to better translate it into their frame of reference or their frame of mind from a cultural perspective, not only language-wise.
And I think that's a really interesting point, because if I look at and regardless of which culture you're in, there's often a presumption that if somebody is issued with a set of instructions or requirements and they don't do it, that it automatically means that person is an idiot or a criminal, or, it's their fault. And I think even within particular cultures, you can find that you set requirements for people and they don't do it. And the coronavirus is a really good example of that. Why are people behaving, quote unquote, like idiots? Well, some of them clearly are idiots, but there's a lot of other people who just see things differently and they have a different perspective on things.
Inside their own perspective, they are absolutely logical, right? Inside their own frame of reference, their own frame of mind, right?
Right, because nobody sets out and goes, I'm going to go and do something really dumb, right? We all have our own reason for doing things. Now, it might be a dumb thing we're doing, but there will be a rationale somewhere. And I think it's really interesting when you talk about these cultural pieces. So there's this perception of non-compliance. The sort of Turkish renegades are off doing all kinds of things. They're not doing what we want, and that needs to be stopped, and they need to do what we want. And, of course, as you've explained, there's just a different perspective on what certain things means, which leads to different behavior patterns. And if you try and assess those behavior patterns using a different lens, you're going to come to the wrong conclusion. And you're going to come to the wrong conclusion around the motivation behind the action. And actually, you're not going to be very effective at influencing that behavior if you don't understand why people are doing something in the first place.
Exactly. And that's exactly where it meets your behavioral science perspective, only in the effect that I say I'm looking less at the individual behavior and the cognitive mechanisms and the biases that drive the individual behavior. I'm looking at the collective behavior of groups of people, of a larger group of people, which is then this country and this national or this culture of a society, which is called by some, there's this Dutch researcher that I'm very much focused on in applying the model called Gerd Hofstede, which calls it also the programming of the mind, right? It's a collective, culture is the collective sum of the held beliefs and habits of the people here, of a group of people that distinguishes them from another group of people. And culture is behavior. And we see directly that if we look from a perspective, I'm a German, these are Turkish people, I perceive that they have a distinct, different culture made out of different behaviors, coming out of different values and a completely different history. Right? And out of these things, so how can I expect that they understand a Western, very Americanized, Anglo-American idea of what is clean business and how should that work? Right? That is very much dominated by an Anglo-American perspective and a view on things and then assumptions on how the legal frame of references work and so on and so on.
And look, one of the things I wanted to make sure we pick up is something that you and I have previously discussed, which is this around something that in the West we call conflict of interest. And so, an example would be if I am doing some business with, I don't have a brother, but if I did, let's pretend I do. If I'm doing business with my brother on behalf of an organization, that's a perceived conflict of interest because it compromises my independence. And yet, as you've explained it to me before, that is viewed entirely differently in the Turkish context.
Yes, exactly. Because if you have a culture that is more Eastern than Western Europe or the US or also the UK, then you have to think that you are dealing with a frame of reference where the family is very important, that is more collective, where large groups and the relation in the groups is much more effective. So what we call a more collective society. Right. And in this collective society, of course, relationships, relatives, and also blood relations are very important. And at the same time, you might not have long-term traditions of a very stable judiciary and a very stable and fair rule of law. And you might not have a long tradition of contracts that are enforceable in front of a court of law. So what is one of the best and most natural principles of control, a control mechanism that you do is say you work with people over whom you can enforce actually the rules that you want to enforce, and on the other hand, whom you can trust. Who can you trust best? Your relatives, your blood relatives. It's a very natural and old and traditional control mechanism, actually. And it's inherently, there is not yet something bad about it, right? It's only perceived as bad by a highly individualistic Western view of the world that would like to have everything as arm's length transaction, has a certain notion of what is fair and what is fair market value and all these kind of things. And you see that's against the difference between things like fair value, fair market value notions versus this haggling approach at the bazaar where price and value are very much more linked to the individual and the relationship. And you have a lot of bartering going on. And in the end, you make a deal and both sides walk away with a smile and think they made a good deal for themselves. No one, if you haggle with someone or for a camel or a carpet, literally, I mean, this is not about fair market value, right?
Yeah, and it's very interesting because whenever I go, souks of Morocco is an example, bazaars in Istanbul is equally valid. I feel very different and are in a very different trading and negotiating environment than I am in London or in Berlin or Zurich or New York or wherever, because the rules of the game are fundamentally different. And I find that simultaneously liberating, but also deeply frustrating. And I'm scared a bit because I have this, in the West, I might be being ripped off, but I'm being ripped off in a manner that's transparent, which is sort of the price is stated, it is what it is, and you go and buy things from a shop and you don't have to do that negotiation. Whereas, of course, I feel ill-equipped to go and negotiate. But in a culture and a society where that's normal, then people come at it from a different frame of reference. And as you say,
on the other hand, the people have a different level of trust, of course, because even if I'm not directly related to the person that I do this kind of bartering with, I know that he has been recommended to me. There are some friends, there are some other ties that we have. And it's in his best interest that I have a good impression. And I also feel that he doesn't want to rip me off. He wants to rip you off when you are a tourist, of course, and going away. But me as someone who's living here or the people here, it's a completely different relationship. It's really a very fine woven mesh of the things. And the more you have these kind of favors owed and relationships and recommendations by other, if he rips me off, some other people will lose face. Right? Because they recommended him to me. So it's in our both interest of a continuing good relationship that he's also offering me a good value. But individually for me.
So the bits that I find feel awkward is because it is slightly awkward because the very things that make it compelling for local people, which is that social network, the kind of embarrassment factor, doesn't exist when you're a tourist who they're never going to see again. And it's very strange because I view it as being really suspicious. And of course, in the context that I'm confronting it, it may well be suspicious. But in a localized context, what you're actually saying is it's significantly stronger, because if I get ripped off in a Western context, I have to go and resort to the law is my ultimate arbiter. And sure, I've got interesting things like social media, which I can start to use in a similar way. Actually, the sort of social proof aspect is interesting that we're moving into that model now, where suddenly consumers have a power because they can share their bad experiences. But I ultimately have to go to a court of law. And you're basically saying, because the lack of historic dependence on a legal system or an unreliable legal system, actually that social pressure is super powerful. And that keeps people in check.
Exactly.
So the approach of sort of saying, ultimately, I'm not worried about being ripped off because I can sue them and they know I can sue them. That's a sort of backstop ultimate position that requires a lot of effort on my part. Whereas the social embarrassment that you're talking about can happen very quickly and very easily.
Yeah, because I could shame them, or someone I know could shame them or something. Like, it's the shame versus guilt is also more the collectivistic versus the individualistic dimension here. By the way, I want to say, I mean, I'm not haggling for carpets here or for camels or anything, right? If I go to a supermarket, there's a price and I pay at the checkout,
right,
just like I would in Germany, only that the supermarket here is much bigger, actually.
That's
right?
it.
And some of the Germans would think they are in the future when they are in Istanbul. Actually, they would rather think they are in New York than that they are in Morocco or something, right?
That is fascinating. And look, so, having explored that concept, that my natural instinct would be massive conflict of interest. But you said actually there are stronger checks. So with my hypothetical brother, he's not going to rip me off for doing anything stupid, and therefore I've got. How do you manage that from a compliance perspective?
Well, what I did mostly was first building trust. Building trust, trying to become a part of the family for the people here, right? I was in the beginning trying to reduce this power distance, that I am the compliance officer perceived as a policeman, having come from Germany at that, right? The principles-based, the rules guy, that will now actually find everyone out and get them fired or something. So
I mean, you are literally the stereotypical nightmare, right? So you come from a culture that's very rules based, even from a kind of Western perspective, quite controlling, and you're going to a culture where precisely the opposite is true, and you're going in to do that with a badge that, and you and I have previously discussed it, I think is hideous. The compliance officer. I mean, that is literally, a Germanic compliance officer in a country that operates on a different basis. That is everybody's worst nightmare.
Yeah.
And yet somehow you've managed to navigate. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah. And I dropped this officer title first. I said, don't call me officer or anything. I mean, we call it here head of compliance first, or actually it's head of integrity and compliance. This was called at that time. And I was stressing the integrity part first very much. The second part was, of course, my wife is Turkish. So I came and I promised everyone on the first day, in 1 year, I will be speaking Turkish to you. Mm-hmm. And I kept that promise. I really pushed myself. I had a good start, but actually I had to get a lot of practice and deeply immerse myself in the environment here. But then at the end of the year, I really started actively speaking Turkish. Meanwhile, I give my trainings and everything in Turkish. And that was very important to break down the language barrier and to be really approachable for them. And really, they can ask me anything. And then I stressed very much confidentiality, the level of trust. And what I was using exactly terminology from this collective and this family-oriented culture. So I said, I'm Uncle Michael. I'm calling myself Michael Amca, which is the uncle on the male side of the family. It's Amca. And the Turkish is actually the language that has the most differentiated terms in the languages in the world for different kind of family relationships. We have different names for the aunts on the male side, on the female side, and the big brother, the little brother has a different name for it. And so on. So, and for the uncles and for the different kind of in-law relatives, you have different kind of titles, and they all are a certain social relationship. And I chose this Amca for me, which is a little bit on the father's side, so has a little more fatherly authority, but at the same time, he's the approachable good guy that also can put his hand on your shoulder and help you. And I said, look, I'm your friend. I don't win anything by catching you doing anything. I think that inherently you want to do the right thing, and I'm here to help and explain it to you. So if you have any questions, any problem even, you can come to me. And basically, if you want, also confess. And then we will solve your problem for you together. But if you tell me everything is going all right and I catch you, then I might have to slap you a little bit, right? Or figuratively speaking, right? Or one of my team members, right? But then I need to take out this kind of authority, but I don't want to use that kind of authority.
So by framing it in that way, you've taken full advantage of those dynamics you've talked about before, right? Which is in the same way that there's a closeness and a proximity in a family. There's also that sort of disciplinary, keeping you in check, making sure that you don't do anything too stupid, not so you don't embarrass the family,
Yes.
all those kinds of things. So you've beautifully encapsulated those dynamics by the choice of the branding.
Yeah, because I said we are a family here. We are all together a family. And the good thing is in Turkey, everybody's on a first name basis, which is strange for me as a German first, but very comfortable actually here. And the way that you would express the distance here is they would call me Michael Bay, Mr. Michael. And I said, don't go away with Michael Bay. If you want to do enemy, call me Michael Amja, Uncle Michael, okay? Or just Michael. And that's where everybody first takes a step back and say, what? What's that guy telling me now? And so I took out this distance because, as I said, maybe I have to mention this here, the other culture dimension next to this collectivity in Turkey here that we have is a high power distance. The power distance is the notion in the society that there are powerful people and less powerful people. And the less powerful people acknowledge the fact that these more powerful people have certain privileges, they have authority, they enjoy certain status and so on. And the rules are not necessarily equal for them. You see that in politics, you see that in other dimensions. Right. So you have basically you have a flock of sheep, that's the group, and you have the shepherd. That one is the leader of the group. That one has the authority. That one makes the rules and enforces the rules also, right? You have this relationship. And I had to first say, I'm not the all-powerful shepherd here. I'm like the good uncle. Right? I'm not even one step above that, like the outside policeman. I'm really part of this family. I reserve a little bit of authority to help you, but basically I'm a part of this larger group. And if you now become a part of this group, then you have the bounds of trust and loyalty within that group, right? And you first say, okay, we solve the problems among us first and talk about everything openly. We find a solution for many things. But of course, I have to tell you, if there's something seriously different, of course, I have to do my duty. We have to have transparency and so on. But my most important job is to prevent that from happening. And then everybody is fine.
Is this a Turkish approach to compliance that you borrowed, or is this something you've created yourself? So if I looked at your equivalents in other firms, would they behave in that way?
I haven't seen it like that with predecessors or with heads of legal departments I know in other companies or not, basically because I'm completely different than the normal classical Turkish manager, because the normal classical Turkish manager would be the one that says, okay, this is my office, this is my big desk, and I'm boss, you subordinate. That is right. They have this power and they embrace this because they culturally come from this more high power distance. But I, as a German, come from a more low power distance culture and came more on this same level of seeing eye to eye. So I was kind of exploiting that and trying to tell them, I personally don't have a problem with being on eye level with you, right? I don't have a problem with this being a little bit more humble and more egalitarian in that way. So that was easier for me to do. And I haven't seen this so much in other companies before. Yeah.
And so I guess a logical question then would be, well, how do you know what you're doing is effective?
Well, I see it by the fact that the level of problems that we are finding, that we are having, are going down. And that at the same time, I'm being approached very much with questions and being consulted and being asked for advice. Or even if something happens, and when it happens, it's mostly now small things or small things where they have questions if they did the right thing or not. They're coming very openly, but they're even coming directly after something went wrong and say, oops, I think I made a mistake, right? And then we talk together about what will be the consequences and how we can handle the situation. But whenever something needs disclosure, it will be disclosed. I mean, within the company and in the level that something happens. But it's no big things have actually been happening anymore, right? And we have a much higher level of also lead compliance to the hard rules and regulations that we have to follow. Right? Before, when I came, it was more this kind of grudging compliance, saying these are the rules and you play by the rules. But if you have gray areas, you exploit them as much as you can because, you play by the letter of the rule. Now we are playing much more by the spirit of the rules. And because of that, keep also to the letter.
I mean, it's very interesting because the dynamic you've highlighted is the traditional kind of, traditional compliance and risk logic, right? Which is, here are some people, and people do crazy things, and we need to control that. And so we'll build structures that basically send a signal: we don't trust you, and we think you're going to do crazy things. So we're going to force you to follow various processes, and we're going to have very strong sanctions. So if you do something wrong, you will get punished, and that'll act as a threat against you doing it, and credible deterrence, and that's how we'll manage the process. And of course, that for so many reasons is super ineffective, not least because it's really irritating. But the second thing is, as you say, it becomes a confrontational game. And so you sit there and say, okay, it's me versus the compliance or the risk people. And if I go to them, I'm going to be in trouble. And I'm going to be in big trouble. So there's no incentive to go and see them, particularly where the punishment is massive.
Exactly.
And so that's a traditional, and you've basically said, actually, I think we can treat people like they're adults. And we'll do that in a way that says, look, if they behave reasonably and responsibly, which might mean they make a mistake, but they come and admit it straight away, then we can behave in a different way to if they are, breaking the rules willfully and just deliberately decided to do the wrong thing.
And the interesting thing that you say, like treating people like adults, is also that the very traditional or old-fashioned Turkish management approach would be also more treating people like children. That comes out of this high power distance that you have the manager who says, well, I know everything best. I'm taking all the final decisions, and I need to show and tell my people exactly what they need to do, and I need to control them because if I don't need to control them behind my back, they will do like anything. So when I'm turning my back, I have to slap them a little bit, and then they're doing the right thing again, right? Then they're doing what I want again, but I don't actually really fully trust them. That's the traditional, more old-fashioned approach that comes also out of this high power distance relationship. So, and then the third factor that's important there, Turkey has an incredibly huge factor that's called uncertainty avoidance. So the people here need and want, are very fond of rules and rules and rules and rules, regardless how dysfunctional they are also. But you need to have rules, and very strict rules at that. If they are not controlled and not enforced, they are negotiable. You don't have to follow that, right?
Right.
So a rule, but it's important to have the rules and they are written because it creates a sense of certainty and there's less ambiguity, right? So especially now all these new compliance approaches or ethics approaches go more to high-level principles and reducing lots of complex rules is something that is very difficult for the Turkish people. It's very difficult for the people here because they want to know exactly what they can do and how much they can do. I want to give an example of that because when we were introducing a new limit to expenses, and let's say the previous limit was 100 Turkish lira for a meal expense, and we raised the limit to 120 or something for inflation. We said everything stays the same. We just raise the limit. So we had a question and answer session with the field force. First question was, okay, does the new limit include the tip or not? Everything stays the same before. The old limit also didn't include the tip. Okay, next question. So does the new limit include VAT or not? Yes, it does. It's like the old one. It's just the limit that changes. The next one. So what if I'm 5 lira above the limit? How often will that be controlled? Who will control it? Will I get a warning a first time? What will be the penalty? What will be the second time violation? So they immediately started to ask for the whole control and a sanction mechanism just to understand the level of their personal risk that they are running and how hard this limit really is and how non-negotiable this is. So interestingly, the limit was becoming actually an attractor. So if I have the feeling if I set a limit of a certain monetary limit, people see this as a value that they tend to exploit as closely as possible, right? Whereas in Germany, at least to my own experience, if I had set a limit of 100, the usual rational thinking, pragmatic thinking German would say, okay, I'm not spending more than 80, because if the limit is 100, that's a good reason that this is 100. I want to stay away from that because I don't want to get into the discussion if this was reasonable or not. So I will spend 80.
Right.
I think that's enough, because 100 is definitely the red line. Whereas here, the question is the red line? Is it a gray line? Is it somehow flexible? What could be the exceptions? And how much will that be controlled? And do I know anyone where this has been exceeded and nothing happens? Because then I will immediately scream, this is unfair, because that person also is a precedent where this wasn't applied. So how can I be guilty, right?
But this is fascinating, because what you've just depicted is exactly what you see happening. And speed limits is a good example, right? So there are some speed limits that we know are enforced to the letter. And so in the UK, for example, there's a specific speed limit that they put outside schools. And you know that if you breach that, there it starts to get very serious. And if you go 1 mile an hour above the speed limit, there's a high likelihood that you're going to get in trouble, and you kind of recognize why that speed limit's there. On the motorways, the speed limit is 70. I was about to say it's 80, but it's actually 70. But everybody knows that you don't get into trouble. There's a 10% plus 1 mile an hour. So 78 is the kind of point at which the police starts to enforce stuff. And actually, effectively, that means 80. So what does everybody do? They drive at 80. And interestingly, actually, at the moment, people are driving at really crazy speeds because there's not much traffic around. So the police have reported some crazy breaches of the rules. But it's fascinating because you sort of you do that calibration exercise. But what I loved about what you just said was that they're actually asking that question. Because the normal way, and I use the term normal very, very dangerously and loosely, because obviously I'm talking about my world, and that's what I view as being quote unquote normal, is that you want that information. But the way you get that information is you don't ask the law enforcers. You find it out, right? So you have conversations with your friends, you read stuff in the paper, maybe you test it out a little bit yourself. So you have mechanisms by which you get, but you wouldn't dream of having that conversation, because it would be seen to be inappropriate for you to kind of be sussing out the real strength of the law and the enforcement regime around it. You'd have to work that out by other means, because you wouldn't dare ask the question, because one, you would flag up the fact as to what you were doing. But the second thing is the law enforcers wouldn't tell you, right? They would just go, well, you should stick to the law, and the risk is on you. We'll see what happens. And I think it's really interesting that people feel it's okay to actually ask that sort of thing. And not just like ask a general question about how many, will you allow us a little bit of time to get used to the new rule? Well, it's literally really hard and fast questions.
Yeah, hypothetical testing, yeah.
Right. How do I'm reminded of my favorite movie scene ever. And it's from Jurassic Park, the first movie. And it's all about at the start, and they've set this thing up, and with the logo, and the logo is the T-Rex for the park. And so they set this thing up, and everybody thinks the Tyrannosaurus Rex is going to be the big villain. And they need to find a way to introduce this surprise villain, which is the velociraptors. So this species, I think they're a made-up species of dinosaur, didn't exist. But anyway, and you get this park ranger that appears, and everybody's scared of the T-Rex, and he starts talking about the velociraptors, and he talks about testing the fences. And he says they're out there testing the electric fences, and they never test the same bit of fence twice. And suddenly you've got this kind of really interesting start point of, here's a really smart animal, right? The Tyrannosaurus Rex looks dumb by comparison because it just stomps around and eats things. Whereas these guys, they have brains and they work hunting packs. And so there's this lovely setup. And I always think about when you go to a new job, or when you come subject to a new regime. Maybe you go to a different country, you become a velociraptor, right? We all do it. We all just sort of test and go, what can I get away with? I start a new job, not now, obviously, but if you start a new job, normally one of the questions is, what time does everybody else get here, right? What time can I get away? Do I have to leave a jacket on the back of my chair? Am I allowed to make personal phone calls? Can I go to the gym at lunchtime? You test all these things out.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting because that testing is done stealthily. Right, it's done sort of subtly. So our inner velociraptor does that test. But what you've basically said here, they just come out with it, right? There's no pretense, right? I need to know this stuff. I'm just going to ask the question.
Yeah, and that shows. I mean, the point that we can have this open conversation, we as the compliance team can have this open conversation with them, of course, shows a certain level of trust, right? Because I could take a mental note of all the people who asked this question and then check their expense reports very, very closely.
Right. Yeah,
right.
That would be the clever thing to do. But it's not great from a trust perspective.
No, but for me, this is actually an example that naturally the Turkish people are very good risk managers in that respect, right? This is on a very high level, exploring all the what ifs of the situation and building the different scenarios and really trying to understand what will happen if I do this and that and really understand the mechanics of this very, very well.
Right. And so how do you answer those questions?
Well, laughingly, with humor. With humor, and patiently and with humor, we answered them all. I took them seriously. I understood. But the most important learning for me from all of this was saying we need to spell all these things out very clearly. I need to be prepared for these kind of questions. Otherwise, they will also not take it seriously because if at all, of course, they will want to have this whole compliance thing, perceive this as fair. Yeah, they need to complete this. They need to see this as fair because if this becomes arbitrary, then again, it would be subject to all this kind of conflicts of interest and relationship mechanisms and so on that they might really try to negotiate or kind of get on the good side of me or something in order to then try to break some rules and have me look the other way.
You basically have to factor in your communication about rules and requirements. You have to factor in that soft stuff. And so it's a natural part of the process is you can't just write in a policy and say, here's the policy.
Absolutely not.
Because you know that they're not going to stick to it. So you've got a realistic assessment of how they will interpret this piece. And so because you could very easily just sit there and say, but we will put it in a policy and we're done, right? My job is done. You're going, I know how this plays out in reality. And so I'm going to have to spend time having discussions that sort of, if it were a small child, you'd get fed up and go, because I said so. But actually, because it's adults, you have this conversation, you have those dynamics, and you lay this stuff down in it's a really interesting idea because the culture permits that to happen and it's deemed as an appropriate conversation. Because I could see in the UK, if you said, will you be enforced, you would be told to go away, you'd be on a list somewhere, and you would, nobody would want to share with you the details of how they were going to police this thing.
Yeah, exactly. But here they know that every now and then there might be a situation where for some reason they come close to the limits or close to exceeding this limits or so. They want to know it exactly because it's a little like with the speed limit. They want to go very close to the limit, right? They want to go very close to the limit, but avoid an accident. But then they want to know, if there's a very sharp bend, how fast can they still drive in that one? If there is no control, right?
And how does that then work with some of these ethical topics that we're talking about? So, if I look at ethics, and I've done various podcasts on this recently. It's a really challenging topic because what is appropriate in one context might be massively inappropriate in another. And the moment you try and codify ethics, you can get yourself into, fine. You can sort of go for the 10 commandments that say, do not steal, don't murder, those basic sort of things. But actually those sorts of rules are not desperately helpful because most people know those extremities. It's the gray areas and the challenging areas. How do you communicate and discuss those?
Yeah,
if you've got somebody that's testing it out in advance.
That's the big challenge. But we have these ethical policies, of course, on top and certain ethical principles. And underneath, we have all these certain rules. And we have basically filled these gray areas with the underlying ethical principles. And I explained that very well. And then I'm open to discussion about that, saying that if you find a hole in the rules, you are not in a vacuum that everything is allowed. There's still a higher level principle that will guide you, right? And there is a certain purpose and intent that you are pursuing, and that can be the right one or the wrong one. Yeah. So we are having these discussions on a very good level, but there I have also, again, I have a general trust approach. I'm showing them I'm willing to trust you. I'm not generally mistrusting you and thinking that whatever you were in a gray area and you did something, that I'm not automatically assuming that you're trying to exploit it to the worst of all possible ethical actions. Yeah, I have an inherent assumption of the good in the people, right?
Right. And so this plays into it's actually the very first podcast I did with an Israeli professor called Yuval Feldman, who's written this book called The Law of Good People. And he said, what we do is we start and we write rules for bad people, right? So we work out what is it we're trying to stop, and we focus everything around that. But of course, what we don't think about there is when we're writing the rules and building controls for the 0.5% or 1% or whatever it is of people that are just going to do bad things, we don't think about the impact it has on the rest of the population. And so we go out and we piss people off and we waste their time and we irritate them because we're trying to stop this extreme situation. And actually, you could argue that extreme situation is going to happen whatever your rules say. If somebody really wants to break the rules and do something dumb or evil, they're going to do it. And so we don't focus on the impact on the rest of the population. Exactly. We focus on
I mean, in every big group of people, you have your certain percentage of thieves, rapists, and murderers, right? Yeah, but I don't need to treat everybody like this just to be on the safe side, right?
Right. And so I'm interested, given you've implicitly adopted that approach, there's something really interesting about the fact that if you are prepared to have the kind of conversations that you're having, you talked about your expenses, a topic where, given there's a hard limit, okay, there are some ethical issues around expenses, but ballpark, there's an example of something that is codified, that it makes sense to codify, that's clear that everybody understands. And because you're having the conversation around the kind of the culture and the spirit of the law for that probably makes it easier, doesn't it, to have the kind of conversation around ethics, because you've engaged them on a topic where actually there isn't much latitude, and you've entertained that kind of discussion there. And so when it comes to something where there is a bit more latitude, where that conversation makes a little bit more sense, because the answer is a bit grayer. The meal expense thing is pretty clear, but they're testing the limits around that bit. But with ethical questions, there are so many nuances that's really interesting that you framed the discussions with you in an area where you don't have to, but you do culturally, but you don't theoretically have to, so that to allow the discussion in areas where it does make sense.
Yeah, but what I do is I approach everybody here with a great deal of respect, basically, also respect of their culture, and say, look, you are a member of a very old culture, and I appreciate this very much, and I studied it. I'm fascinated by it. I have a great appreciation. And so why should I assume that you are automatically doing something completely unethical when you are slightly outside of the area of the very clearly codified rules? Why should I assume that you are one of this 5% of rapists, murderers, or thieves, right? So maybe you would also, because this wouldn't be such old, stable society that was actually a world superpower in the Ottoman Empire times, right? If it was based on complete anarchy and complete self-serving actors all the time, right? So there must be some kind of, in these very strong and traditional cultures, of course, there are very stable and very strong moral elements that I can also rely on. So I can also appeal to this underlying very high and very strict morals that I know exist in this culture, to say, of course, based on that, I have a certain level of trust here that everybody here inherently wants to do the right thing, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really lovely way to look at it, because as we've discussed before, the compliance brand suggests you have some uncompliant people that you need to make compliant, right? So we're in the business of reprogramming people by default. And actually what you're kind of saying is, look, it's not about reprogramming. It's, compliance piece is around sort of shepherding and supporting and assuming that their start point is not to go off and do something crazy, but generally speaking, to try and do the right thing.
Exactly.
Recognizing they have the potential to do that, but actually let's try and shepherd that and make that happen. And let's build that kind of intrinsic motivation.
It goes much, much closer to the concept of nudging, basically coming from the behavioral side, but I say it more in this cultural communication sense. Exactly. It's more guiding the people to follow their instincts that they should already have, but where they are maybe a little bit left alone because of these all kind of the rules that might confuse them, and because of the maybe more Western dominated context of this multinational corporation with all these kind of rules and policies, where they might be really honestly confused and maybe also misguided by some kind of incentives and other things. So then appealing a little more to their own natural cultural instincts, right? There's one thing that we call the corporate culture, and that's all the things we aspire to with the values of the corporation, but also with different rules and policies we have. But I mean, don't have to deceive ourselves. If we are in a multinational country like Turkey here, people are to the biggest percentage of their behavior, they're following their own national culture here, because that's the culture they have been immersed in since their birth, and the culture that they went through their whole time at school, university. And that's a culture that they wake up in the morning in their home, and then they go to the business and wear the corporate culture like a suit to business. And they get out of that suit when they leave the office, and they are immersed in their family and their friends, their normal social environment. And if after a few years they change to a different culture, they wear a different kind of suit. Right? So it's naturally that you see that this kind of corporate culture and values and all these behaviors is on a completely different level than these more national culture instincts that are not innate, of course, as we know. It's acquired after birth, but it runs so deep, these kind of behaviors, that they are so much more important than what we try to do on these normal corporate culture levels where we want to affect behavior.
I think that's really interesting, because as you were talking, I was struck by this image I had of, and let's be really rude about certain subsets of the population because it's fun. But you know that in Spain, for example, there are German tourists and English tourists and other countries as well that go there that basically don't go on holiday. They just, all that happens is they get a bit more sunshine and they behave just like the way they would do at home, and possibly even worse.
Exactly.
And they stand out. Because it's sort of, it's particularly often it involves lots of alcohol and unsophisticated behavior in a man, and they go and eat food that they would eat at home. There is no attempt whatsoever to integrate. You even get people moving there and making no attempt to integrate whatsoever. And I'm struck that if you think about how those people stand out, and they're often embarrassing, I think back to just before the lockdown in Spain, there were British tourists running around getting drunk, and kind of the police were having to move. It was dumb and embarrassing. But they make no attempt to engage. They might as well, if you could find the warm weather in their home country, they'd be just as happy. And you see how that stands out as a strange kind of dynamic. And that's almost what a global policy and a global approach to things is going to do. It's going to feel that, the analogy runs out after a while, but this idea that it feels very different in that environment. But it does illustrate that people tend towards the culture that they're in. And so you're right. If you've got people stepping in through your door as a multinational in their own home country, and you're expecting them to become part of something different, that either involves them acting all day, or it's going to fall apart. And it's more likely to fall apart because acting is really hard work if you're faking it all day.
It's not only faking. They might try to adapt this really, but then put them under pressure, put them under stress. How will they react? They will react according to their more innate instincts or according to their most basic programming. And now ethical dilemmas or pressure to meet targets and other things, you put them under stress. So what is the first values and the first behaviors that they turn to behave? The culture ones, or the corporate culture ones, or the national culture ones? So if you put people under pressure, they will more likely react to their national culture behaviors, of course.
Yeah, you've just actually, it's made me think interestingly about. I wonder whether I'm going to look into this. I wonder whether international companies, when you get blow-ups, there is a greater likelihood or a propensity in different places, right? I.e., not in your home country. And there's lots of, and clearly confirmation bias is kicking in hugely here, but I'm thinking of lots of examples where that's the case, where there is a global piece that's imposed, and actually it's been a distant office that's blown up. Now, there's a whole load of other reasons, but I wonder whether there isn't some form of propensity around that, because the moment you step outside the kind of global norms, you've crossed the line. You're kind of behaving differently anyway, so you might as well keep going. And I think that's a really interesting point that you make there around the sort of one-size-fits-all global stamp, and word comes down from whether it's New York, whether it's London, whether it's Berlin, whether it's Zurich, whether it's wherever, and stamps its foot down, you're right. At some point, people are just going to go, well, how do I normally deal with emergency and pressure situations? The answer is I don't think. I just do what I naturally do. And what I naturally do is what I've been doing all my life and what I have been brought up with as I've been growing up. So I think that's a really interesting observation.
Exactly. And that's the situation that we discuss, of course, in all this thinking about ethical decision-making, doing the right things, having a sales representative in the field, in the situation maybe to behave in a certain way towards their customers, and then putting them under target pressure or other things, right? And putting them maybe in an environment where they are afraid of breaking any rules because of punishment and other things. You put them under enormous pressure. So how will they react? Will you expect them in that kind of situation to speak their mind very freely, speak up openly, talk about everything? No, it's very, very hard work in this situation to get this level of trust and give them this level of security to speak up so freely and voice freely if they have any concerns. Yeah,
that's interesting as well, because actually, so you're putting them under pressure anyway for revenue or whatever reasons. But let's imagine that you're in a clash between your national or your local culture and the global culture that's being imposed on you. One of the interesting things, of course, that's going on there is the moment there's tension between those two things. Firstly, you're gonna go with your gut instinct, what feels right to you. But the second piece is, if anybody challenges you on that, they're kind of challenging who you are, and so it becomes a culture war that almost says, right, not only have you done something we don't like, but I am going to implicitly take issue with you and your national identity. And we know that if you put sort of national identities and who people are under pressure, you criticize them for who they are and almost like where they have come from and how they've grown up. That doesn't end particularly well, because you're criticizing the essence of what they belong to.
Exactly. And then if you do that and if you criticize that, you lack the respect and the appreciation for those cultures. And now we're back exactly at the point, that first sentence I heard when I came as an internal auditor to Turkey. Mr. Michael, you have to understand, Turkey is different. Now, now when I'm here, I understand it. At that time, I didn't. I was the corporate internal auditor coming and saying, well, there are the rules and the standards. We set them in Germany. You're not following them. They said, well,
right.
They are written for another reality than our reality, right? I mean, we don't have bad intent. It's not that we are too stupid to understand them, but some things in this country are different.
So how do you manage the challenge of something is not permitted globally, so the head office says no, and yet local custom would permit you to do it? So if I think back to my conflict of interest with my imaginary brother, corporate rules say you must disclose, and maybe you're not. Let's just make it really crazy, right? I'm not allowed to do a deal with my brother because that's a conflict of interest. So that's banned. And yet, my own sense of control, local custom is that I can. And in fact, it's not only I can, it's a good idea, because I trust him and I can hold him to account in a way that I can't a third party. How do you manage that conflict?
Well, in the end, of course, you have to follow the global rules and the global standards that we have. We do have that, but you need to explain it in the right way. So how do you frame it? You frame it in the way that, look, we are a local family here and a lot of other local families, and they might be happy doing this. But as a local family, we have these big brothers and relatives that we are a small branch of this family, and they have some stricter rules. And if we do something here that might fall back bad on them in total, then that will be a big trouble, not only for us, but also for them. So by doing something here that's questionable from the perspective of the whole world, but here in the country, it would be okay. If you do that, you are endangering a lot more people than just yourself. It might be totally okay and well-intentioned from your own perspective, and there might be no harm, but overall, it would look bad and might harm a lot more people. And by that thing, you actually appeal to that responsibility for the bigger context and give them the responsibility and say, well, and look, and no one will blame you for not doing that. No one will blame you for not pursuing that opportunity, right? Because this is not a missed opportunity. You're just showing that respect that you really applied the global standards that we want. And in that respect, no one will blame you that you didn't make your number in that kind of thing. But please, actually, what I say, I encourage you to tell me that. tell me about this story. Tell me about this dilemma. Let's create transparency about this. Let's put it out as an example for other people. You can say no in such a thing. You can do the right thing that we all expect. Let's actually praise the people for them and give recognition for it. Show the example to everyone. And by that also make sure that there's actually no pressure to do that in secret.
Two things that occur to me off the back of that. The first one is that you're already thinking about where that might happen. Right. So in terms of, if you can start to recognize and say, look, there is a clash between the globally imposed standard and the local culture. And we're, rather than hiding and pretending that doesn't exist, we embrace that thing and we say, okay, this is going to happen. And so we have to build a framework around it that doesn't say it's never going to happen and it's unacceptable, but sort of says, we know that this is likely to happen. There is a strong propensity that things might, and therefore we manage around that by having an honest conversation about it.
That's exactly my local risk management is actually that. I take the global rules and the standards, I try to view them with the local mentality and say, where are the most likely problems where I will culturally run into difficulties? These are the things I have to watch most closely. I have to explain most closely. I have to guide them. I have to encourage them. I have to take the whole exercise of an effective compliance management system on that particular areas.
Right. And that's interesting. So you're basically, and you probably don't do this formally, but the thought process is, I risk assess from a local perspective the things that are coming out of the machine that might cause the most amount of problems. And so actually recognizing, and this probably has nothing to do with the seriousness of the rule. It's actually to do with the clash of the cultures. So you could have something that's very small where there's a great propensity to cross the line, and something very big where there's a very small. So you probably need to spend more time thinking about those small irritants, i.e. the things that human beings will find most difficult, rather than focusing on the things that seem most important, because your biggest risk is in those spaces where people will dive in and default to their natural behavior. And so I think that's interesting, because there's an expectation, again, that because we think it's important in head office, we expect everybody else to think it's important. And there will be some things where there's no, that's not the thing you need to worry about. The thing you need to worry about is the stuff that's irritating or countercultural or just feels weird. That's when you've got the greatest amount of human risk. I think that's a really interesting kind of risk assessment module that you probably implicitly go through without calling it that.
Because it's not only the risk at that point of something going terribly wrong in terms of compliance. So let's name it the industry that I'm in, pharmaceutical industry. We promote pharmaceutical products to healthcare practitioners here in the country. So for me, the risk of having over 300 medical sales representatives in the field, seeing a certain number, 10 or 20 doctors every day, and having small amounts of hospitality with them, like a cup of coffee or sometimes a lunch or the other thing, all these small interactions there, and that the fact that they aren't allowed to give them any kind of gifts or something is a much bigger risk, even if this is monetary and from the transfer of value, very small things, and some things are allowable by any policies, but this is for me a much bigger risk than a third party risk for a very big contract with a local service provider, right? Where you do your due diligence and you check all the anti-bribery controls for this one big transaction. But I say, look, I have thousands of small transactions going on every day where there might be so many small kind of ethical gray areas and exploiting the rules exactly to the letter. And the one transaction by itself is absolutely compliant and culturally okay and from a global perspective okay, but 1,000 of them are not. Right?
Yeah. And that wow, that's I love that because it's genuinely looking at, with the back to my favorite topic, genuinely looking at the human risk, right? Where is the human risk greatest? The answer where people are in a position where they have a propensity to do something you might not want. And we can easily turn around and go, well, they shouldn't do it, or we can conclude that that's going to happen, and we work with that dynamic. And we say we need to find a way around this problem. And of course, that leads me to my second observation, what you're saying, which is I think there's a really interesting feedback loop that gets missed by larger organizations, which is sort of, right, we will decide centrally what we want globally, and then we will impose it. So it's kind of command and control. It goes down to everybody. But there's a really important piece that says, actually, there are going to be some things that they are blind to that won't feel like big issues in, whichever city they're in, but will feel like massive issues on the ground. And so there's a really important piece here in multinational, multi-jurisdictional organizations to have that feedback loop that would allow you to say, look, don't even think about, so a policy that said you may not have a cup of tea with someone, you may not buy them a cup of tea, right? That would kill your business, because either people would not be able to do business in the normal way that you've described, or they would just be breaking the rules anyway, because it's going to happen. And so that little rule that sounds very innocent somewhere else could be massively problematic. And so you need to have that feedback loop that allows you to make that point. Because in what I think is interesting about multinational organizations is they try and export the home country philosophy and the home country. And what you've beautifully described is the fact that sometimes those exports don't travel very well. And so actually what you need to do is you need to be thinking, if you're going to operate globally, there are going to be some things that really matter in certain jurisdictions that aren't deal breakers, but from a global perspective, but they are in that jurisdiction. And how do you change that thing around? And I think often it's one-way traffic, which is the center dictates to the rest of the world, and therefore causes these sorts of problems.
What's important is that it is not only the big compliance violations or the violations of a rule that is, and the risk of having any fines or sanction because of that is actual risk to the business that we said, out of these thousands of small interactions there that make or break the business, because it's the relationship to the customer and how far can you go and do something that is allowable under local culture and maybe perfectly innocent under local culture, but maybe prohibited by a black and white global corporate rule, because from a more Western compliance-based perspective, it is something that is doubtful or going into a gray area. You would rather prohibit that, but maybe it goes so much against the local culture that it will really put you on the way of being rude to your customer in a local perspective, right? And my typical example here is the Turkish glass of tea. That maybe by the international rules of the industry, your sales rep wouldn't be allowed to invite the customer to this glass of tea for hospitality. On the other hand, it might be just as well that the customer is offering this to you. So it would be just something you might reciprocate, or there's almost zero transfer of value in there. But it's just this is really absolutely culture here, that this is something that you drink while you're talking, right?
Right, and it's so in simple terms, what's interesting is if you look at the rule, the global rule would be there to stop bribery. And what you're saying is this: no one is being bribed by tea. Actually, what they're doing is it's not even like water. It's a mechanism to facilitate a better conversation.
Exactly.
And so this idea that you're sort of advantaging yourself by doing it, it's the other way around, right? Is you are disadvantaging yourself, not because everybody else is being inappropriate, but because that's just what people do. And if you move away from that, far from reducing risk, it actually increases the risk, either in terms of your own staff thinking it's a ridiculous rule and therefore thinking all of your rules are ridiculous, or the customer thinks you're weird if they stick to it, and therefore destroys your business. And so I think it's really interesting that something designed to protect the business could actually have the opposite effect.
Yes, but on the other hand, of course, in my industry, it's these are the biggest problems, right? Hospitality to healthcare professionals is very strictly regulated to the rules, and we have to keep to that, because then again, the gray areas are coming where it's more than a cup of tea, and how regularly it gets, and if it's a lunch every week or more than a week. And of course, the other side might be expecting and demanding something, and after that they maybe ask for some other favors and for small gifts and other things that, again, from the individual transfer of value would be perfectly innocent and in the normal cultural way perfectly acceptable or even expected, but just as a multinational, you just can't do it. And then again, it's the point that you have to give this sense of identity to our people and say, okay, we don't do that, because of the bigger implications, because of the bigger picture, even if locally this would be perfectly okay. So we have to make it up in creating more value on another page, right? With the kind of information that we give to our clients, for example.
Yeah, and you're right, because the argument against the tea thing would be, it starts with a cup of tea, Michael, and next week it'll be a Ferrari. right? And I exaggerate slightly, but that's the sort of logic behind it that says, we've got to stamp this whole thing out. And where do you draw that line? And I'm not suggesting that if you were to open a business up in Somalia, I suspect there are some interesting practices there that you wouldn't necessarily wish to tolerate, that might be necessary. And then it becomes a question, I guess, of saying, look, can we do business? If we can't do business in this jurisdiction on our terms, then we probably shouldn't be in that jurisdiction. But there's an interesting thought process around having that discussion. And I think one of the other interesting things that you raise, and I'll kind of close on this because I know we're running out of time, is really this: if you spot this stuff in advance, you can have a discussion with people when they join the organization, and you can kind of make it clear, or even as they're thinking about joining the organization, where you can make this stuff clear to them. And then you don't have people joining on a presumption. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges, is if it's sort of, you have to work that out for yourself. And the organization doesn't make any attempt to bridge the gap. So in induction training, for example, you can make it clear why these things exist and how that operates, and to hit this issue head on, rather than just pretending that if you write it down on a piece of paper, everybody will automatically understand. And I think the lovely bit that I keep hearing as you articulate things is that human engagement and that willingness to help people you understand them, but you also help them to understand the global organization.
Exactly. And the point is this also: every culture has certain strong aspects also that will help you support compliance and ethical behavior. Otherwise, it would never have been a stable culture. It would be anarchy and fall apart, right? So you have to dig out those gold nuggets and actually use those to transport the message in the areas where you might have potential conflicts. Right. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm analyzing the local culture in the different kind of dimensions, saying I can exploit this love for detailed rules here by actually fulfilling that need and explaining it very well. And I can frame things and exploit this kind of collectivism and family terms and terminology, and can put that to good and active use in order to explain the things that might from a local culture be acceptable, but from the global multinational perspective are not. But I can frame them in a way by exploiting certain parts of the culture, because there's no culture in a country has the right to judge any other culture as good or bad. Cultures are relative, right? Everybody has their own culture. No one can say I'm superior to you or I'm inferior to someone else.
I love that. I tell you what, in a world where there is so much polarization and divisiveness and kind of toxic language around different cultures and different people who look different and people who sound, it's lovely to hear that, because I think what you've done is, you are a beautiful advertisement for the global family. And the way I think you've articulated and fulfilled your mission, serves to pull out the strength in humanity. And let's face it, at a time when we're facing unprecedented challenges, at least in our lifetimes, it's a very warm and wonderful message. And I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank you for your thoughts, because I think it's really, really interesting stuff, really important voice in this whole process. And thank you also for sharing them on the podcast. It's been absolutely phenomenal, enlightening, and a lot of fun. So thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for having me. It was my pleasure.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Michael for appearing, and of course to you for listening. If you're not already a subscriber, I'd love you to join those that are, and you can do that via any of the major podcasting platforms. It's available on all of them. If you like the show, please spend a few seconds just to leave a rating and a review. That helps other people to find it, raises the profile of the show, and enables me to continue to attract high-quality guests. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. In the meantime, stay safe, and thank you for listening.